Today we're going to be making a personalized newspaper application, a web app, in Java using a toolkit called TeaVM. This is a project I've been dreaming about doing for years, and so today I'm going to be showing you how to do it, and we'll see how far we get. So the first thing to do when you want to build a TeaVM application is go to the tvm.org website, and under documentation there's a nice getting started section here, and my recommendation is to use the Flavour framework. It provides a lot of useful stuff, and we can just run the Maven archetype as shown here. Put it in a folder where you want it to go, like develop, and it'll ask you a couple questions. So it's going to ask you a group ID. If you have a domain name, mine is frequel.com, you reverse it, so com.frequel. If you don't have a domain name, you could use com.github, for example, if you plan to host your project there. And artifact ID, I'm going to call mine news. This could be whatever the name of your project is. Version 1.0-snapshot is very common. And for package, you could use the group ID again. I'm going to call mine com.frequel.news. And then it asks for confirmation. You just hit enter, and you'll have a folder matching the name of your project. And you can go in there, and already you can do a Maven clean install, and it'll build your project. If you haven't built this sort of project before, Maven will download dependencies from the internet, so it'll take a little while longer. In this case, I've got them all pre-downloaded. And so it's running TeaVM, and then at the end, when it's done, we'll have a folder. You can see it saying right here, a target news 1.0 snapshot, a war file, but we also in the target folder have a folder called news 1.0 snapshot, and you can see in there it's got an index.html. So we're just going to open that up in a web browser. We'll go to develop news 1.0 snapshot, and we'll open up index.html, and you can see this is the Flavour sample application. And in this application, if you enter your name and hit enter, it shows the name down the next line. And not very exciting, but the key thing here is that the interactive features are being done without any calls over to a server, and are being done within the browser using Java compiled into browser-friendly JavaScript. So let's take a quick look at the code to see how this works, and then we're going to jump into converting this application into a customized newspaper. So first we're going to open up the project. I'm using NetBeans. TeaVM works with any IDE. So we're going to go into the develop news project, and it showed up as an openable project to NetBeans. And some of the important things in here are in the source packages folder. And so if we look in here, we're going to see the client.java file, and note there's also a file in other sources, source main resources templates client.html, which we can see over here on the right. And this HTML file is what we just saw on the screen. It says please enter your name, but it has bindings to client.java for things like the username. So there's some magic TeaVM attributes like HTML value and HTML change that say this input component, the input component is this text entry field here. The input component value comes from a field called username and gets written into a field called username. And So we can see there should be getters and setters in client.java for a field called username. Get username, set username, and so that's how the HTML component gets bound to this variable called username. Any change to username in here gets reflected back in the UI, and anytime the user edits and hits enter, it gets set back into this variable so we can use it. Now, how does the name field get updated on the screen? That's handled down here where it says hello and then a different tag, HTML text. And HTML text decides what to put on the screen based on the value attribute, and in this case it says username yet again, and TeaVM allows you to put the name of a property and it knows to call the getter. So it'll call get username and populate the text shown here from that field. And so that's how these are being kept in sync. If I change this and hit enter, it knows that the field that got set into that variable needs to be updated in this text field. So that's well and good, but we want to do a custom newspaper. And so for that, I'm going to start editing this HTML page. So to start off, we need a nice big header to start the page, saying that this is my newspaper. And then on the page itself, the idea here is to show stories from a bunch of different newspapers on the web. Pull them in and show, at the start we'll make it a couple top headlines from each newspaper, and then later on we'll try to make it more customized, look for headlines of interest. So we're going to need a section for each newspaper. So since there will be multiple newspapers involved, we will use a TeaVM feature called standard for each. And this makes a loop. If you're familiar with the Java for each loop, it's very similar. And we're going to say each time through this loop, we're going to use a variable called paper to hold the current newspaper, and we're going to have a list of newspapers that we'll call papers. So all the papers that we are going to show will be in a variable called papers, and as we pull them out one by one, we're going to store them in a variable called paper singular. And that's the standard for each loop. Now, by itself, it doesn't do anything, but what's in the middle of the for each loop gets repeated once for each newspaper. So first of all, we're going to show the name of the newspaper. So we're going to put a heading. Actually, I should use H2 because we used H1 earlier. Go to the next level of heading, one smaller. And we want to show the name of the newspaper. So as we saw in the example, and in fact it's still on screen down below, there's this HTML text that lets us insert a variable into the HTML page. So we'll say HTML text value equals, and since we're going to have a variable called paper, which is one newspaper, TeaVM lets us pull out values from a variable using a dotted notation, so we can do paper.name. And now we don't have this paper variable or a paper class yet, but when we do, we'll give it a field called name, and it'll be pulled in here and placed on the page if we close our tag properly. Now so far we're just showing a header for each newspaper. We'll show like let's say we do Hacker News and New York Times. So we'll just show a heading for each one. But so far there's no stories. Well, that's not very interesting. So now each paper is going to have multiple stories to it. So how do we show a list of things? Well, we just saw that a minute ago. It's a standard for each. So we'll do a double nested for each loop. And in this time, we're going to have each story in a variable called story. And they're going to come from the paper.stories. We'll have to make a stories list in the paper variable. And so now, oh, and I forgot, we want to put these all in an ordered list. So we'll have them numbered. Story 1, story 2. So in HTML you do that with an ordered list. And then each story is going to be a separate list item. So now we want to show each story's title, and let's start with the title. We've got a lot here we've got to do. So we're going to, yes, use HTML text to show the title. HTML text. And we're going to say story, because we've created the variable story right here. I'm going to say story.title. Close off the tag. And that's going to put each story in a numbered item in the list. So if we had 2 papers, each with 3 stories, we'd loop twice for all of this, and then for each paper we'd loop 3 times, 1 for each story, putting its this title in a list. Okay, now at this point we don't need this old stuff from the sample project hanging around anymore, so we'll clean that up. Now if we try to build this, let's go see what happens. We're going to get a bunch of errors. It's not going to be happy with us. So let's rebuild, maybe even clean install. And TeaVM is going to tell us, I don't know what any of those variables are. It's going to say, I don't know what story is. I don't know what paper is. And so we're going to have to add those in. But let's just see what it looks like when it can't find something. Because this happens all the time. You add something in to the HTML file, and you forget to add it in your Java code. And everything worked just fine. How could that possibly be? I haven't saved anything yet. Okay. We'll edit that out. So we're building our project now with a bunch of variable names referenced in the HTML that aren't in the Java class. And so TeaVM is going to tell us soon, I can't find, there we go. Variable paper's not found. Property name was not found. Property sorry. So we've got to fill all that in. We've got to make those things in the Java code. So for every, usually you maintain a mapping with similar names. So if you've got a client.html, in this case we've got a client.java. Most of the time we actually call it view. So if this was client.html, we might call this client view.java. But by convention, the base client one typically doesn't get the view suffix. So let's go into client.java. Now we're going to need a couple key things in here. We're going to need papers, which is the list of newspapers. And then for each paper, we're going to need, in each paper, we're going to need a name and a list of stories. And each story is going to have a title. So let's go over to client.java and start creating those things. Now first of all, client.java is from the TeaVM template, so we don't need anything about username anymore. We want to keep main because that tells TeaVM where to attach the dynamically generated HTML. So let's leave that alone. The rest of this can go. And now, and actually let's do our standard indentation here. Okay, so now first of all we need a list of papers. So let's create the list of papers. And now we're going to fix the imports. Now there's no, let's not do the one for paper. Well, I guess we'll delete that afterwards. So we'll clean this up here in a minute. We don't want JavaFX paper. We're going to make our own. And so we've got the variable papers, but we need the getters and setters so that TeaVM can find it. So we're going to use NetBeans code insert feature to insert the getters and setters. But still you can see all the red under paper because we haven't declared what a paper looks like. We haven't defined a paper class. So let's go ahead and create one. NetBeans lets you do Alt-Enter, and then you can, we don't want to add an import for a paper class because those aren't what we want. We want to create our own. So let's go ahead and do that. And it takes us right to it. Let's get public. And in paper, we wanted a list of stories called stories. And we'll use the getter and setter generator to fill in the stories. Oh, let me do that in a minute once we've defined what a story is. So we're going to add our imports, and we're going to create the story type as well. So we'll do Alt-Enter, whoops, sorry, on story, create class story, and what did we say story needs to have in it? It just needs a title. So we'll create a title string, add the getters and setters for that, and go back. We've got it's not complaining about story, that's funny. So we're going to add the getters and setters for stories. And there was one more thing in paper. We need the name of the paper. So we'll add that. Name. Getters and setters for name. And then, is there anything left that it needs? So the other thing we're going to have to do is back in client.java, we've got an empty list of papers when we start up. And so it's going to be pretty boring. There's not going to be much to see on the web page. So let's fix that. Let's create some papers and add them to the list. So we will create a new paper. Paper 1 equals new paper. And we're going to need the name of the paper, so we're going to do Hacker News. Now right now we're hard coding all of this just to see what the user interface looks like. Next, later, we will actually fetch the headlines from these news sources. But we got to start somewhere. We got to see what the UI looks like. So we're going to want story 1. And let's make a list of these things. I'm going to put in story 1 and story 2 in for Hacker News into a new paper. And let's fix the imports, and it lets us create variables. So let's do that. Whoops. Story 1. New story. And what does a story need? Just a title. So what's a good Hacker News story? Hackers attack. And story 2. New story. Hackers save the world. Alright. So we've got our 2 stories defined and our paper, and we're going to add that paper to the list. And there's a lot of red there. I need to create the constructor, so I'll do that in a second. So papers dot add paper 1. Okay, so we need a constructor, and I think it should offer to create the constructor. Good. And so we'll jump over to that, and it gives us the name that we had hard-coded as a string. Really, we want it to be the title, and we don't need it to throw an exception. We want to say this.title equals title. Alright, so at this point we can easily construct a story using that string. We've created 2 of them, and now this constructor should not exist for the paper. I don't know why this isn't highlighted red. Or did it? Yeah, there we go. All right, so now we need to create a constructor that takes a string and a list on paper. And so we'll jump to that. Over in paper. All right. Now again, it gives the funny hard-coded names. That's the name of the paper, and we've been calling this list stories. And just like in the other one, we'll just assign them in here. Name equals name, and this dot stories equals stories. All right. So at this point, we've created our dummy data. We've created data structures to hold it. Plain old Java objects, POJOs. And we are going to add in the paper to our list of papers. And, this is right. We need to do client.getPapers.add, because this is the static main method. So we'll get the client, add the paper to it. We could also do this in a client constructor if we wanted to, but this is all going to go away because right now this is just test data. And you know what? Just so we can see what it looks, let's see if this works. All right, so we'll go back over here. We'll do another build, and when this is done, if we created all of the fields that matched what TeaVM was expecting. Let's see. Non-static variable papers cannot be referenced. Did I forget to save? I forgot to save. All right, so if we manage to find all the variables in the HTML and declare them, then TeaVM should be able to bind everything, and it'll output the new application that we can try out in the browser. So let's see. Did we get everything? Is TeaVM happy? Yes. Okay, so soon it'll assemble the WAR file. We don't actually need the WAR file, but because we're going straight to the HTML. So let's reload the page. My newspaper. Now, it doesn't show anything. What went wrong? So let's open up the debug window and refresh and see what the console says. And hopefully it'll give us some hint as to what is missing here. No. Let's see. So when we create the main class, we create a client. We create the stories. We added the stories in. The paper name. We add the paper to the client papers list. And then when we go into client.html, we got a for each for each papers. We show the header. And this is where the debugging begins. Now, I said a minute ago that this probably should go in the client constructor. Let's do that right now. That's not really a good place to do it. So let's create the constructor. Create a client. We'll add in the paper this way. Start a build going. While that's running, double check it one more time here, see what we might have forgotten. Because the client.html is reading first from a variable called papers, and then for each one, use the HTML text to insert the paper's name. So as long as the papers list has a paper, and that paper has a name, Hacker News, then we should see it. Alright, build complete, reload, there we go. Alright, so we just had to move the initialization logic into the constructor where it should really be. Alright, and so now everything's working. It's iterating over each paper. We've only added one so far, Hacker News, and for each story in Hacker News, it's adding a numbered item into the list. And if we look at the source code here, we can see just how close this looks to our template. So let's so inside Let me put this on the side where it'll be easier to see. So here we can see our header 1 for the newspaper, header level 2 for Hacker News is the first paper we have, and then inside the ordered list we've got one list item for each one of the stories. Okay, let's add in one more newspaper just to see how that looks and make sure there's not some weird problem with two papers, and then we can work on somehow getting this information live instead of having it all hard-coded. So now we're going to make story 3, story 4, paper 2, and now this is the Gray Lady, New York Times. And we don't want to use the same stories from Hacker News. Those would not show up in the New York Times, I can tell you that. And what would the New York Times be about? Virus sweeps the world. And you know what? Let's have hackers destroy virus. Sounds like a good ending to this story. And we'll add paper 2. At this point, we should see 2 papers, 2 headlines each, and we're pretty confident that our UI logic, our very basic UI logic, is working. And then we'll figure out how to get these headlines from these real sources, which is going to be a little more challenging, because we're going to have to download the HTML from them and then scrape it to get the content out. Alright, moment of truth. Yes, okay. All of our papers, all of their headlines, showing up just great. Okay, that's kind of a good stopping point, so I hope you enjoyed this first part, and next up we will start scraping the data from real websites to show on our custom newspaper.